So yeah, I'm delighted to welcome Adam to give this short paper to interested parties perhaps about what non-research orientated sciences might be and why we should be taking them seriously in the science and religion dialogue. So I will give you a wave when you've got 5 minutes of your 20 minutes left. But for now, it's over to you, Adam. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much for having me and for coming to hear me speak about these non-research oriented sciences. I just want to preface this talk by saying this is still a work in progress, so I'm still kind of massaging out the exact details of what I want to capture in this term, non-research oriented sciences. And I also want to start by acknowledging that unlike, I think, all of the other short papers being presented at this conference, non-human animals are not the focus of my talk. However, there will be one picture featuring a non-human animal, so you have that to look forward to. So I'll start just by giving a brief outline of the talk. I'm going to start with some general motivation to get us kind of primed for thinking about the non-research oriented sciences. I'll then kind of give a brief exposition of what I think these non-research oriented sciences are, and I'll end the talk with a discussion of why I think we as scholars of religion and science ought to care about them. All right, so some brief motivation. Oh, sorry, before I get into that, there's kind of two big main takeaways from this talk, two main goals. The first is just to kind of sketch this concept of NROS, or the non-research oriented sciences. And again, the second is just a gesture towards why it's a useful concept for us in religion and science studies. Okay, so some brief motivation. Here's what I take to be a pretty trivial statement that's furthermore true. The field of religion and science is very broad, and it's broad in all kinds of ways. We study all kinds of things under this umbrella term. And if we just focus in on, our different ballada here, we just focus in on religion, we can talk about religion in all kinds of different ways. We might talk about it very generally as kind of religion with a capital R. Or we might talk about it specifically. We might talk about particular species of religions, so things like Christianity or Buddhism, or new religious movements. And we might even get more specific and talk about particular denominations. Maybe we'll talk about Calvinism, or maybe we'll talk about Zen Buddhism. And even here, we can get more particular, and we can talk about particular ideas associated with these different forms of religion. Maybe we're really interested in divine action. Maybe we're interested in anatta. Once we're at this level, we're at kind of the level of theology. And I think a lot of work in religion and science focuses at this level of theology. But of course, we all understand that religion is more than theology, right? There's practices involved in religion too. So there's literature that looks not just at kind of theological concepts in the religions, but considers kind of everyday practices, everyday religious experiences, and just lost my words, religious experiences, religious rituals, and so on and so forth. Likewise, on the science side of my trivial statement here, we can think about science very broadly, science with a capital S, all of the sciences, or you might think about science in the particular species like physics or biology or geology. And here we might look at particular subdisciplines. Maybe we're interested in quantum mechanics or in genetics. And then here we might be interested in particular ideas associated with these subdisciplines, so things like indeterminacy or natural selection. And of course, once we're here, kind of parallel case, where on the religion side, we're at the level of theology, here we're at the level of theory. But of course, there's a lot more to science than just theory. There's practices too. And I don't just mean this in kind of the, sense of kind of more contemporary history and philosophy of sciences turn to practice, where there's a big emphasis on the methods that scientists use or the role of experiments in science. I mean more focusing on everyday scientists and thinking really about what they're doing, the spaces in which they're embedded, and the aims that these kind of everyday scientists and everyday settings have. And I'm going to claim that for many everyday scientists, research is not their main aim. Theory, development, or kind of refinement of theory is not their aim. Okay, So this brings me to now discussing the non-research oriented sciences. I'm going to try to give some general characterization of this concept. I'm going to start with a kind of negative approach. So I want to kind of say what this research-oriented, non-research-oriented distinction is not. The first thing that I don't think it is this science-technology contrast. So it's not the case that the non-research-oriented science is just found in kind of this technology side. I think non-research-oriented science is firmly within kind of the traditional science side of this contrast. Likewise, it's not the same as this kind of industrial academic contrast. So even though I think most non-research oriented science does take place in more industrial contexts, it's not as if all of industrial science is going to be non-research oriented. There's surely at least some research-oriented industrial science. And finally, I don't think that the research-oriented, non-research-oriented distinction is the same as this applied science, basic science contrast, although this is one of those points where sometimes I wake up at night and worry, like, maybe it is the same. But we'd like to talk more about that in the Q&A. I'm happy to explain kind of my reservations there. All right, so all this said, even though I don't think this research-oriented, non-research-oriented distinction is the same as these three kind of more common contrasts, nevertheless, it is the case, I think, that NROS often does take place more often in kind of more technological or industrial or applied settings. Okay, so now that I've given this kind of negative characterization, let me give a more positive account of the non-research oriented sciences. So here's kind of a first pass. Basic idea is I want to capture these scientific activities which aim at the solution of particular practical problems rather than at knowledge production or theory production, or even theory kind of refinement. So one important aspect of this concept is that to kind of qualify as a non-research oriented scientist, you still need some amount of scientific training. So, just having specialized craft knowledge, if you're a plumber or an electrician, I don't want to kind of include those classes of people under this heading of non-research oriented science or non-research oriented scientists. But the big kind of central feature of this form of science is that, again, research or theory formulation is not going to be our central goal. Our central goal is going to be more related to kind of production or just kind of running through more or less routine experiments. All right, now I want to give a couple of examples to try to kind of put more flesh to this concept. So my first example is genome sequencing. So genome sequencing often happens in private labs. What happens is maybe some other lab has some samples they're interested in. You send your sample over to your private lab here. They'll sequence the genomes, send the results back. Of course, there's also this kind of now big consumer industry where private individuals can like take swabs from their mouth, send those samples over to these companies, and then be told something supposedly about their genetic ancestry. So folks in these settings are in some sense just sequencing genomes. They're just kind of running these routine tests. They're not in the business of revolutionizing genetic theory. It might be the case that some of these companies, these kind of bio startups, get started because someone kind of happens on some new, more efficient way of sequencing a genome. But once kind of that initial idea is hit upon, once the lab is kind of put together, the scientists, the geneticists employed in that space aren't trying to kind of refine genetic theory or even come up with new ways of sequencing genomes. You're just kind of running through the steps already developed. And of course, this still requires extensive knowledge of genetics in order to be running these tests. So I think this is a classic example of a non-research oriented kind of science. Another example, this is where we get our big bird here. We have this condor. Next to the condor is a conservation biologist. So here, conservation biologists are often employed by government organizations. So we're not in kind of an industrial complex or an industrial setting, we're somewhere slightly else. And these folks are in some sense kind of just saving fish or birds. Of course, you're going to be studying these organisms. You'll be studying the environment in which they live. And in that sense, you might be producing more knowledge about those species, about this environment. But you're not really aiming to develop some kind of new theory about, I don't know, the origins of birds, or some new theory about, I don't know, the ways in which organisms interact with their environment. But of course, in order to be a conservation biologist, you still need to know an extensive amount of biology. You need to understand your species. You need to know kind of their geographic distribution. You need to know particular facets of their physiology in order to work with them. But again, kind of everyday practicing conservation biologist isn't setting out to kind of revolutionize or even make slight changes to extant theories about these organisms. Usually you're focused on something much more confined. You're interested in how lead travels up a certain food web in a particular location. Okay, so hopefully these two examples help to kind of illustrate this idea of the non-research-oriented sciences I'm trying to get at. So now I want to move on and talk about why we as scholars of religion and science should care at all about this type of science. And so I think there's two big reasons for folks, especially for people who are investigating kind of religion and science relations. The first is what I'll call kind of facetiously naturalism or accuracy. And the second is fruitfulness in general. And so let me say a little bit more about each of these. So first off, naturalism. What do I mean by this? I just mean accuracy. When we talk about the way in which religion and science are related, we typically want to be talking about religion and science as kind of they actually are in the world. We don't want our conclusions about their relationship to be conclusions about something that doesn't actually exist or that no one actually interacts with or cares about. And so, again, if much of religion as practice isn't actually theology focused, we might think maybe we should look beyond theology. And likewise, if much of science isn't actually research-oriented, then we should look beyond the research-oriented sciences. Now, in fact, I'm going to argue that most science isn't research-oriented. This is a big claim. How do I get here? I get here by using some data that's at least specific to the US, but I would expect to be kind of extendable throughout the globe, though, of course, I might be wrong. But I started with some statistics gathered by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, which runs this annual survey of occupational employment and wages. And so I looked at data from last year. And according to these statistics, there's about 1.3 million people with life, physical, and social science jobs. And so I took this to be kind of a litmus test. If you're in this kind of job category, you're more or less a scientist. So in the US, there's roughly 1.3 million scientists. Now, this survey divides up these kind of general occupations by particular industry. And so I want to focus in on, who's doing research-oriented science versus who's not. And so I assume that people in certain industries would be more likely to be research-oriented. So for example, folks in this industry called research and development, I assume those folks are probably doing research-oriented science. There's about 200,000 of those. Likewise, I assume people employed in colleges or in universities would be doing research-oriented science. So there's about 100,000 of those. But that leaves about 1 million other of our 1.3 million scientists who are not in kind of these research-oriented roles. So the rest of them are employed elsewhere. Graphically, it looks like this. So roughly 3/4 of all folks with life, physical, and social science jobs, at least in the US, are not employed in these industries focused on research. So if we take this data seriously, then it seems like most science, at least again done in the US, isn't going to be research-oriented. So what does that mean? Why do we care about this? Well, again, if we want a naturalistic account of science, we want accounts of science that are reflective of what science actually looks like on the ground, then we should be thinking about those non-research-oriented sciences. They make up 75% of all active sciences, or scientists, sorry. This means that kind of our theory T characterizations of science, these very general characterizations of science that focuses on theory production, fail to capture kind of the mass majority of science as done in the actual world. Again, because the non-research oriented sciences don't aim at theory production or at deductions from those theories. So all of our kind of classical characterizations of science, often drawn from philosophy of science, where we think of science as, in the business of falsification or verification or something like that, that's all failing to accurately describe what these sciences are up to. And so insofar as those sciences are incredibly common, fail to adequately characterize science as practiced. Okay, so that's one reason why we might care, is if we want our accounts of science to be accurate. Another reason we might care has to do with what I'll call fruitfulness. This first form of fruitfulness is kind of outward facing. The idea is this. Oftentimes, when we're discussing the relation between religion and science, we want to have some type of conclusion that's kind of useful for public engagement. We want the public to think in certain ways about what the relationship between religion and science is. And if that's the case, then our accounts of both science and of religion need to be kind of useful for that purpose of engaging with the public. Now, if NROS forms such a large component of kind of the total scientific space, then it seems reasonable to conclude that NROS might form a large component of kind of public perception of science, whether one is religious or not, whether one's working in religious circles or not. And so we might expect that we might be able to better engage with particular religious communities, again, if we can speak to forms of science and of religion that they recognize. So if we can incorporate discussions of these non-research oriented sciences with which maybe our particular religious community might be more familiar, then maybe we can more fruitfully engage with them. Okay, if you're not a big fan of this kind of more outward-facing form of fruitfulness, here's another type of fruitfulness that's more inward-facing for scholars themselves, for the scholarship. I think that taking NRO seriously can open up a lot of avenues for scholarly pursuit across various disciplinary lines. So if we're more kind of philosophically oriented, this encourages us to think beyond science as just kind of falsifiable or verifiable again, or even in this kind of Kuhnian tradition of, everyday normal scientists are just doing puzzle solving. Because again, in the non-research oriented sciences, they're not just kind of focusing on some particular theory and figuring out ways to tweak it. They're dealing with something kind of entirely different. On the other hand, if we take kind of more social scientific approaches, if we're more interested in doing ethnographies or interviews, surveys, things like that, rather than just kind of investigating these more academic circles, there's a lot of social scientific research on the relation between religion and science. Most of that focuses on kind of university embedded scientists, so people working at big research institutions. But taking the NROS seriously encourages us to investigate other spaces, like our biotech labs, our startups, and even things like science museums. Finally, if we take more historical approaches, again, taking NROS seriously encourages us to think about the non-theory rooted sciences, things like cosmetics or things with big industrial ties, like big tobacco or big oil. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions we might ask in those places about how kind of certain forms of science get funded and how that interacts with maybe certain religious predilections. So these are kind of some very general areas that scholars of religion and science might kind of move into as a result of taking NRO seriously. Here's some more kind of particular research questions we might investigate. So here's one question. We might wonder if the research-oriented sciences religion relationship is different at all from the relationship between non-research-oriented sciences and religion. More particularly, we might wonder if possible conflict is more or less likely with the non-research-oriented sciences than with the research-oriented ones. And finally, we might also wonder if scientists that do non-research-oriented science are more or less religious than their research-oriented peers. All right, so these are just a couple of possible directions that we could go if, again, we're taking NROS seriously. All right, so just to recap what I've done in this talk, I've argued that we should think seriously about these non-research-oriented sciences, things like commercial gene sequencing, things like conservation biology, things like cosmetic chemistry. And I think that doing so will provide one, kind of a more naturalistic, more accurate approach to religion and science relationships as they're actually instantiated in the world. And second, it can provide kind of these fruitful, unexplored avenues for investigating these relations between religion and science. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, do we have any questions?
Thank you.
There you go.
Hi, Adam. That was a great presentation. It's cool seeing people making about science and religion at UCI. I was thinking about when we were talking about definitions of science, Liam Bright co-authored a paper earlier this year on scientific norms and how it's really important when we consider whether something is or is not science. And his paper specifically was on scientific norm of communism, which is to say openly sharing data, communicating with the public about what one is researching, so on and so forth, and why therefore some in industry practices can't be called or shouldn't be called science when those sorts of norms aren't being followed. So maybe the guy with the bird might be a scientist because he's sharing his data and it's being publicized, but someone doing in industry genetic research or genetic sequencing might not be. So I'm wondering how you would handle an objection like that when it comes to your definition of non-research-oriented sciences.
Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, I hadn't thought about incorporating these scientific norms into the conception. I guess I can say one thing here, which is I think the particular scientific norms that we focus on and take to be kind of an essential part of science is often derived from some prior conception of what's going to count as the sciences, and often that conception is focused on research-oriented sciences. And so I think a norm like the communistic norm is one that kind of emerges because we think like, what are the good sciences? Well, we think they're kind of the research-oriented sciences. We have these classic cases of physics research or biology research, things like this. And so I might worry that kind of starting with those scientific norms is going to kind of prejudice or it's going to overly pre-constrain the kind of space of sciences that we're willing to investigate. Furthermore, it's not quite clear to me that kind of non-academic publics recognize those particular scientific norms as definitional of the sciences. And so again, if we're interested in talking about forms of science that are relevant to public audiences we want to engage with, then it's not clear that we should start with those scientific norms.
Thank you.
Hi, Adam. I found that amazingly thought-provoking. Thank you very much. I am a research scientist and a translational scientist, and I work with diagnostic scientists in a UK National Health Service lab in genetics. And so I work across these boundaries, and if indeed they are boundaries. And the thing about the lab where I work is that it had a very long history where if anybody in the normal course of their normal diagnostic work found something they couldn't account for, it had to go into a research domain because otherwise it would not be resolved. So this puzzle, it can't be resolved unless you go off and actually solve it. Now, therefore, it seems to me that one of the things that demarcates theory formulating or theory testing science from whatever you might call translational or routine science is whether one has the capacity, permission, funding, curiosity to actually follow the funny thing that happens. I mean, the people who go off and sequence a DNA sample in the genomics labs are very often have minimal scientific training. They certainly need minimal scientific training. There are famous cases of the, say, the prenatal genetics labs in the States where the individuals who are looking after the sample will be school students, because all they need to do is make sure that sample doesn't get mixed up with anything else when they stuff it in the machine. So I'm really interested. I think, to me, I feel really uncomfortable with the differences you're making, and I think it's fascinating, and I'd love to have more conversation. But so basically, do you feel that it's likely that there are some people who are or aren't scientists, or do you think there's effectively some kinds of actions that are more or less what you might call classically, theory-provoking science, whatever you say?
Good, thank you. Yeah, this is really great. I think so. The first thing I'll say is I don't think the distinction between research-oriented and non-research-oriented has to be super firm and distinct. I think there's going to be a spectrum. Likewise, in terms of just classifying people as scientists or not scientists, I think that's also going to be spectrum. There's going to be certain actions, certain activities that kind of more or less predispose us to categorize people as scientists, and actions that aren't. I don't think I'm super interested in drawing these firm boundaries. I'm happy with kind of amorphous boundaries, but I do think that people in these more translational spaces, they are still perceived as scientists. If I have my cousin in the biotech lab, and he's just sequencing the genomes or just doing whatever kind of more routine thing he's doing, I think he'll still identify as a scientist. I'll still kind of perceive him in some ways as a scientist. He's a geneticist. He's employed as a scientist, even if he's not coming across these problems and trying to figure out how to resolve them. He's doing something more routine. Is that getting at your worry?
I think it is. I think it relates to, I remember at the theological college where I trained, somebody set up a session where it was talking about everybody is doing theology if they're religious, because everybody's it's reflection. And I wonder whether you're actually sort of moving in this kind of territory.
Good, thank you. I don't know if I want to go quite that extreme and say that everyone is doing science, right? Science is just an extension of common sense or something like that. I don't know if I want to push it quite that far. But I think, especially in the context of religion and science, I do want to kind of push us more in that direction and open us up to thinking about these other types of spaces that are traditionally neglected in our studies. And so again, thinking about science as it takes place outside of university labs, outside of particular research institutions.
So we've got 2 questions I've already seen. I'll try and get to the other 2, but I'm going to do these 2 first.
I'll try to be concise as possible. So I'm very happy with your way of talking about methodological pluralism in science, and that's, I think, very helpful. Even in the dialogue between science and religion. So perhaps we should talk about the sciences and religions to be more sensitive to that area. But I'm a bit worried about the way you kind of dismiss the role of induction, falsification, and theorizing, because I think they exist across the board. We use induction in everyday life. We use falsification in everyday life. And even observation needs theory. You need, this is the classic idea of theory-latedness of observation. So even your friend who's studying how to conserve condors, he is arriving with some kind of pre-existing theory. So it's fudging the edges of your distinction, I'm afraid.
Good, thank you. So I think I need to make I should have made this more clear. My point isn't that the non-research-oriented sciences are somehow like, theory-free or something like that, independent of all theory. Surely all scientists are operating with particular theories. As you said, all observations are theory-laden. the distinction I was trying to get at is that our non-research oriented scientists, like our conservation biologists, aren't in the business of like focusing on theory and trying to make changes to theory. Instead, they're just kind of accepting it as background and working on other types of problems. And so these kind of classical conceptions of science that we often inherit from the philosophy of science, which really focuses on theory and places that front and fore, are kind of missing the point when it comes to these non-research oriented sciences. Because again, their focus isn't theory, even if theory is still somehow necessary for them to do their work.
Thank you. I think we're going to go one question and then we're going to go, but let's take it.
It's a really quick one. The examples that you gave were people doing what we might call practical science. So I just wonder where people who are even further on the edge might fall in your consideration, people in science education and science communication.
Good, yeah. So I'm not quite sure about folks in science education or even science communication, largely because I'm not sure if we would think of, say, like a science journalist as a scientist, or likewise, I don't know if I think of a, I don't know, I like volunteer at a science museum. I don't know if I think of my like fellow employees there as scientists. I'd be very hesitant to say that. Or even, you know, if I think about, you know, teachers in public schools, I don't know if I'd say science teachers are scientists. So there I'd be hesitant. But whereas on the other hand, I think folks employed as conservation biologists, I think would standardly be considered scientists. Likewise, you know, if I'm a chemist at a cosmetics factory, you're likely to be considered a scientist there.
Is the audience happy for one more question? Yeah. I think you're causing a lot of questions that will be discussed this evening, Adam.
I started to ask this question before you started to give the lecture. But it seems to me that your problem is that you have redefined what the word science means. I mean, I guess I'm a Googler. Let me read what the dictionary says science is. The systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation, experimentation, and testing of theories against the evidence obtained. There is no science unless there is underlying research behind it. I'll give you one little example. I have a good friend whose son was in the police force. The policeman retired very early, and so he retired from the police force, where he'd been a sergeant, and he needed another job, and he went to the National Health Service, to the local hospital, and after a relatively short training period, he was reading mammograms and deciding which of these mammograms needed to be put before a medical practitioner. Now, he's not a scientist, and he wasn't doing science. And his career was, but his career was in a science-based environment. So I don't think there is, I think your description of a non-research-oriented science is a non-description. There is no such thing. And I don't know why you refer to the universities, by the way, because there's a lot more science in Britain done outside the universities than is done inside the universities.
Just a nice, easy one to finish on.
Good, thank you. Yeah, okay, so I guess there are two parts here. I'll start with the definition you read out from Google, which is correct on all things. I think when you read this sentence, as embedded in a philosophy of science department, I just hear the influence of philosophers of science here. And when I think about that definition, and then I think about how science, this term, gets used in kind of everyday conversations with non-philosophers, with non-scientists, I think there's kind of this disconnect. I think you're right. The definitions we find on the internet are going to make essential reference to theory and make essential reference to research as a definitional part of what science is. But I also think that's because those definitions are derived from this tradition in which philosophers and other academics have focused on explicitly research-oriented sciences and have taken those as their paradigms. So I mean, there's recent moves in philosophy of science proper too, where folks have become worried. They've said, look, all of our general accounts of science have been based in physics, but many of these accounts just don't apply to, say, biology. Laws don't work in the way, laws don't work the same in biology as they work in physics. Some will argue. And so they want to open ourselves up and say, look, we need to kind of take biology as kind of our paradigmatic science rather than physics, and think through, how does that change how we conceive of science? In a similar vein, I want to say, look, we've been focusing on this very particular type of science, but there's these other things that many people still refer to as science. They're called science in at least common parlance. And so I want to ask, what happens if we take those as our starting place? How is that going to change how we conceive of science? And again, will that open up any interesting avenues for further research, which I think it does, especially in religion and science. Good, so that's kind of on that definition side. Now, in terms of, and I guess this is related to your argument that NROS just doesn't refer to science. I'm trying to kind of redefine science. And I'll say, yeah, in some sense, I'm trying to redefine science. I'm trying to get us to think beyond kind of this academic conception of science that we're all very used to, and take more seriously kind of more public usage of this term science. And I think, again, if we're trying to engage with public audiences, not everyone is going to try to do that. But I think there's quite a bit of literature in religion and science which tries to engage with different non-scientific, non-expert publics. But I think we can more effectively do that kind of engagement if we're working with the conception of science that's kind of actually in common use among those folks.
Thank you ever so much, Adam. I think there are probably a lot of questions that are going to carry on this evening. It's a real shame that you couldn't be with us today, but thank you for provoking us, and I think the conversation will continue. So we can all give Adam a round of applause.